What is up, everybody? Koryu's Bloody History. I'm back. Sorry, I was off a couple days. I went camping in the mountains. It was fun. And that's pretty much all I have to say about it. So, we're going to continue on. Testimony of Robert Shaw, who seems to be one hardcore fucking spy. Working undercover at the State Department, right? Like, what do you mean you're undercover at a government agency? So you work for the CIA, but you're undercover at the State Department. What? Huh? Explain that shit. All right. So, back to the conversation between Mr. Goldsmith, obvious CIA stooge, and Mr. Shaw, one-time head of Cuban operations after David Atlee Phillips, and before David Atlee Phillips, in Mexico City. So, here we go. How many photo bases were there operating against the Soviet compound without drawing a diagram? I do not know, but I think there must have been 2 or 3. Are you sure you were not the case officer overseeing the surveillance operation against the Cubans? I certainly am. So Mr. Zambernardi was not working under you? I did not consider him working under me at that time. Later on, when he was replaced, and I'm not sure whether Dave Phillips was there or not, I did move into this operation. I'm trying to think of the cryptonym for the operation. I cannot recall. And the chap who then handled it was Zambernardi, Zambernardi's replacement. I think his name was Humphrey. That was the surname. Lou Humphrey, I think. I'm not sure. What was the purpose of the photo surveillance operation? Primarily to identify people in touch with the foreign embassy. Would everyone's picture be taken? No, no way. Whose picture would be taken? For example, you would normally, in an operation like this, be limited by time available for the photographer. You would be limited by daylight. You would not photograph a milkman or a mailman or somebody who would be there repeatedly. You would not photograph a staffer of the embassy if once you knew who he was, unless he was walking with somebody. You would not photograph a regular visitor to the embassy if you knew who he was. Would you photograph all foreigners? I don't know. I would have to say the answer is no. I never photographed any of them. Did you mean would all foreigners be photographed? You see what they're doing? You see how CIA fucks play with the words? I would say, given the limitations that I have enumerated, namely how long a person can sit there and watch, they have to take a break now and then. Daylight, Sundays, they probably did not photograph because there is little activity. I'm sure there were considerable down periods in this sort of operation. No, I would say all foreigners were not photographed. Ideally, you would like to have a picture of anybody who went in and out of there, surely. Okay, so do you see how they fucking do this with these sentences? Okay, so no, I would say all foreigners were not photographed. Ideally, you would like to have a picture of anybody who went in and out of there, surely. Those are 2 contradictory fucking sentences. I fucking hate these people. I understand that. My question is, while a surveillance base was in operation, would a primary purpose of it be to take pictures of foreigners? Yes. That would have been a primary purpose. Not necessarily foreigners, but people you do not recognize. Foreigners are Mexicans. Mexicans are foreigners to us, of course. Here we go, more with that wordplay. Another thing they did, by the way, was they tried to photograph the license plates of automobiles that came to these embassies. During what hours were these photo bases in operation? I do not know. I would say most likely during business hours and proper daylight conditions when the photographer was available to do the job. Would you read back that answer? Court reporter says, question, during what hours were these photo bases in operation? The answer, I do not know. I would most likely during business hours and proper daylight conditions when the photographer was available to do the job. As a matter of routine, when would photographers have been available to do the job? I do not know. I was not involved in these operations. I used to see quite a bit of coverage. What were your primary responsibilities when you were down there? You were not involved in the photo surveillance operation. You were not involved, excuse me for interrupting you. Go ahead. You were not involved in the photo surveillance operation. You were not involved in the wiretap operation. So my question is, what was your primary responsibility? My primary responsibility was to try to effect penetrations of the Cuban government. I spent a good bit of time with the Cubans of the non-Castro persuasion, attempting to identify Cubans of the Castro persuasion that we might go after. By go after, I mean attempt to recruit. I spent a lot of time collecting information from the Cuban assets on the outside to process into the intelligence reports on what was happening in Cuba. We had a system set up in Mexico City under an agent called A.M. Sale. who was the representative of the exile community. He would arrange to meet, help debrief Cubans who were arriving constantly from Cuba on the way to the United States or to Mexico or somewhere else in the world, people who were exiting Cuba. Mexico did not break relations with Cuba, as did other countries of the hemisphere. The OAS recommended that Mexico did not do it. So when the refugee flow dried up in Florida, we probably had one of the most productive operations there in Mexico City regarding information on what was going on in Cuba. I spent a lot of time with AMSAIL on that. Did you ever try to recruit Eusebio Escu? His name is Eusebio Escu. Yes, ASCUE. First name EUSBIO. I did not try to recruit Askew. That may have been attempted prior to my arrival, in which the man would know about it. If it had been attempted, would be Mr. Thomas Hazlett. Hazelit. Let's pull everything on Thomas Hazlett. Mr. Goldsmith then says, what about Teresa Proenza? Proenza. No, I never made any attempt to recruit Teresa Proenza. Do you know if anyone ever did? I know we had an officer in Washington who had formerly served in Mexico City who was very interested in Teresa Proenza. That officer's name is Charles Anders. Is he still with the agency? It's my understanding that he is. What about Guillermo Ruiz? That does not even ring a bell. Ruiz is a very common Spanish name. You want me to tell you who he is, or if you have anything on him, maybe it might ring a bell. Apparently, Mr. Ruiz was a Cuban intelligence officer at the embassy, Cuban embassy. I do not recall him there when I was there. What did you say that Mr. Ray Swider's responsibilities were, if you said? I did not say. I used his name. He was another officer, like I was, in Cuban operations. Do you know whether he had anything to do with photo operation? I do not know. He may have. I do not know. I do not think he did. He may have. After your arrival in Mexico City, did anyone attempt to recruit Askew? As far as I know, there were no attempts made to recruit Askew after my arrival. My memory could be playing tricks on me. I know I never went after him. Brief recess was taken. Goldsmith then says, I would like to get into the number of people who were in Cuban operations in October of 1963. September, October of 1963. Could you tell me again how many? If you could show me a list of the people at the American Embassy at that time, I think I could pretty well quickly in the station. If you have such a list, I probably could very quickly identify those that had some connection with Cuban ops. The agency has not given us that list today to have for this purpose. Do you have one lying around? No. So far, according to my recollection of appearances, we have Mr. Phillips, yourself, and Mr. Swider. When I arrived there, Redacted would have been there. He would have been gone by that time. John Zambernardi would have been involved in the technical ops. I'm not sure whether Peggy Margaret was there or not. How many case officers were there in Cuban operations? Probably just three or four. I'm not sure. Notice how he's not sure of fucking anything. Anything. Goldsmith says there were 3 case officers, probably 4. At least 3, yes. Dave, Ray, and myself. Was there a 4th? I do not know. I can't recall offhand who else was there. Wait a minute. Lorna McKay was there as a researcher. What was it called? Research analyst. I'm interested only in case officers. I do have a list here referred to as CIA 169-70, which has a list of agency employees. Would you please examine the list? Okay. Perhaps there would have been myself, Ray Swider, Dave Phillips, and Lorna McKay. Was Lorna McKay a case officer? Lorna McKay was not considered a case officer. Yes, I guess she was a case officer. Like, oh my God, I hate this fucking cocksucker. Lorna McKay was not considered... Yes, I guess she was considered a case officer. I do not know what cases she handled. You were only her fucking boss, you asshole. She did more of what we call intel analyst work. She had officer rank, I believe. I believe she was a GS 9 or 11 or something. I do not remember. But Peggy, the girl I mentioned a while ago, was not there until 1965. That was about it. The ranking would have been Dave Phillips, myself, Ray Swider, Lorna McKay. How did you divide up your responsibilities? Let me interject. Jack Stewart was there, but he was not in Mexico City. He was in Yucatan in the consulate. So he wasn't there, is what you're saying, right, motherfucker? See how he's muddying the water? I don't know. This person was here, but they weren't there. This person did that, but they didn't do that. What a fucking cunt this guy is. What an anti-American fucking scumbag. Like, I fucking hate all these fucking intelligence cocksuckers. God, it makes me fucking angry. Jack Stewart was there, but he was not in Mexico City. He was in Yucatan in the consulate. Fine. How did you divide up your responsibilities? We were given certain agents to handle, and we handled those agents, and Dave Phillips would decide what other activities he would pass around. I notice Mr. Goldsmith says, which were those activities? Anything that might come to light that Dave would, an ad hoc requirement or something like that, he might just ask any of us to help out, or somebody else might ask us to do something. I went out and helped surveil a meeting one time for one of these guys down here. It had nothing to do with Cuban ops. What procedures did the four of you establish for reviewing photographs? The only procedure that was established was route the photographs and show them to any agent personnel who might be in a position to identify the persons in the photographs. Did any of you identify all the photographs in the Cuban operation branch? I don't know. Was there a system to do this? If there was, I did not set it up. You see how this guy was like a long-term fucking CIA agent for 30 fucking years? He worked all over the goddamn agency, and in like the couple years he was down there in Mexico City, he knows nothing. He fucking knows nothing. My fucking God. If I was there, I didn't set it up. When I got photographs, I would show them to L.I. Tamil 9 and have him tell me who they were, and I would write a contact report and submit it to my chief, who was Dave Phillips. I would assume that Ray Swider probably did the same thing with his agents. Mr. Shaw, unless there was a system for reviewing the photographs, you had no way of knowing that all the photographs were being reviewed by you or other Cuban officers. Is that correct? I had no way of knowing. I was seeing all the photographs. That is true. I assumed I did. You had no way of knowing that. Not unless I would have gone to pick them up from the man who took them and developed them, which I did not do. With regard to the transcripts, did you have any procedure for ensuring that all the transcripts were being reviewed? Did I have a procedure? No. The station routed the transcripts to various officers. Win Scott quite often routed them. I noticed you had a transcript somewhere here. We'll look at the transcript later on. Win Scott often routed those to a specific officer. Were all of the transcripts pertaining to Cuban operations that were sent to the station reviewed by at least one of the Cuban operations case officer? I do not know. Was Mr. Scott a very demanding man? What do you mean by demanding? Did he expect his employees to work hard and perform thorough, competent work? I assume he did. He never said so in so many words. It was my understanding that until he was remarried, he worked long hours in the embassy before I got there. Sometimes he had people in there at 9 o'clock at night. Compared to other station chiefs that you had worked under, was he more demanding or less? I would not say he was any more. He expected work out of his people and got it. Is it fair to say that Mexico City Station had one of the biggest telephone surveillance operations in existence? Certainly in Latin America. Any CIA station? I don't know about any CIA station. Certainly in Latin America. It ate up a lot more man hours. Real quick, guys, in the chat, if you could fucking pull the actual date that David Atlee Phillips got to Mexico City. If I'm not mistaken, he didn't even get there. I'm confused of the dates on when he arrived there. So if you could pull the actual date David Atlee Phillips shows up in Mexico. Is it fair to say the Mexico City Station had one of the biggest telephone surveillance operations in existence? Certainly in Latin America. Any CIA station? I don't know about any CIA station. Certainly in Latin America. It ate up a lot of man hours. In light of the fact that Mr. Scott apparently was a demanding man and that you had one of the largest surveillance operations in effect in Latin America, your testimony today is that you do not know whether the Cuban operations case officer reviewed all of the transcripts. I do not think that the preface was necessary. The latter part of that, in which you asked me if I'm aware that all the transcripts of the Cuban ops were examined by the Cuban ops section, I would have to again say I do not know. And then he discussed something off the record. So you can tell that fucking Goldsmith is getting impatient with this guy's fucking bullshit, and Shaw is calling him out for being impatient with his bullshit. Here he says, I do not think that prefacing was necessary. That's his way of saying, go fuck yourself, if you couldn't interpret that. Just went off the record for a moment because Mr. Shaw had a question about where his car was parked and whether there would be any problem about that, and I indicated I don't think there would be a problem. Mr. Shaw, do you recall who delivered the photographs to the station, the tape from surveillance operations? It was my understanding that the technician picked them both up. Bob Zambernardi would have picked them up from the agent. You're talking of the Cuban embassy now? Yes, and consulate. It was my understanding that he would have had picked them up from the agent who took the photographs. The agent who took the photographs developed them, painted them, and turned the prints over to Mr. Zambernardi. That's the way I think it worked. How would you actually get to review the photographs? You would bring them to. Who would bring them to you? Usually, I do not remember who brought them to me. I have the impression it may have been Lorna McKay, but I could be wrong. Maybe Bob brought them to me. I do not know, but I would get a batch of photographs to go through. Who had reportedly responsibility for passing along the information that had been obtained from the photographs and the transcripts? There was little reporting that came out of the photographs. Usually it yielded what we call operational information rather than intelligence information to enable us to develop a better understanding of who was in the area, of who was in the Cuban embassy and what they were up to. As far as reporting intelligence that came from those, it probably was reported by the reports section of the embassy. Next to Win Scott's office was the CIA chief's, or the CA chief's office, and next to that, I'm getting in the new embassy now. I do not remember where the report section was in the old embassy. We had report officers who actually prepared most of the reports from raw reports, if you will, reported by the case officers. Again, I would like to point out that these photographs yielded very little reportable intelligence. It was mostly operational intelligence. Understood. Who was George Monroe? George Monroe was a former agent, special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigations who retired or resigned. I do not know how he left the Bureau and worked in Mexico City on the outside as a non-official cover asset for Win Scott. And Goodpasture, I believe, had a lot of contact with George Monroe. Let's pull everything on George Monroe. I very seldom saw George Monroe. I had nothing to do with him operationally. Do you know what his responsibilities were? I believe his responsibilities had to do with dealings with the Mexican government, liaison responsibilities. I think George was used by Win because George had good contacts in the Ministry of Interior, which would have been sort of the equivalent of the Department of Justice here. And out of that ministry came, for example, the man who became president of Mexico. He was the station asset contact, not agent. You mentioned earlier Mr. Charles Anderson. Is that correct? Yes. Do you know why Mr. Anderson had an interest in Eusebio Askew? No, I don't believe it was. I think it was Teresa Proenza. I do not think he had any interest in Askew. Who was the individual who had interest in Askew? I do not know. I said if it had been before my arrival, I would suspect it was redacted. He was carrying the ball down there and was responsible for that sort of activity. I do not know that he did, but if it happened in, say, late 62 or somewhere in there, it probably would have been Tom who would have done that. What was Anderson's position at the embassy? He was not at the embassy then. He was at the embassy back in 65. I do not know for a number of years. At that time, Charlie had gone back to headquarters and was involved in Cuban operations from headquarters, the details of which were not made known to me. Whether they were made known to Win Scott or Dave Phillips or others, I do not know. When would he have made an effort, if he did, to recruit Teresa Proenza? I'm not sure that he ever tried to recruit. I am merely saying that he had a lot of interest. I do not think anybody ever tried to recruit her. If they did, they were wasting their time. Why were they wasting their time? She was a pretty tough nut. I never saw, if I can remember, I do not remember any vulnerability of Teresa Proenza. What was the nature of Mr. Anderson's interest in her? I do not know. Some Cuban operational interest. Maybe trying to get some information from her through a third party. I have no idea. When did he spend time in Mexico City that he would have had an opportunity? He visited Mexico City quite often. Even though he was not stationed down there, he visited often. That's correct. He made trips in and out of Mexico City. Do you know what Teresa Proenza's position was at the Cuban embassy or consulate? I think by that time she was out of the embassy. Was she not? I do not remember. She left. Teresa Proenza was a Mexican. She was not a Cuban. And I'm under the impression that by the time I got there, Teresa had left the embassy. I may be wrong. I think that she was involved in cultural activities. Goldsmith then says, do you know whether Mexican intelligence would have had any penetration agents at the Cuban embassy or consulate? I think they would have tried. I don't know how effective Mexican intelligence was. I did not deal with it. It would be assumed that they made every attempt. The Cubans were gradually removing Mexicans from their employ from the Cuban embassy. I think it highly unlikely that the Mexican government, given its position, was the only government in the Western Hemisphere which maintained relations with Cuba. It would have been highly unlikely for them to have tried to pitch a Cuban national. On the other hand, I think it would have been likely and would have been expected of them to have tried to find out from any Mexican working in the Cuban embassy what was going on. What this comes down to, of course, is gardeners and secretaries. What do you make that distinction between a Cuban national and a Mexican? Or why do you make the distinction between a Cuban national and a Mexican? I make that distinction because of the flap potential. If the Mexicans had attempted to pitch a Cuban and the Cuban had not accepted that pitch and had reported it to his superiors, the Mexican Foreign Office, then would have had a problem with the Cuban Foreign Ministry. Of course, the Mexican government was also taking a risk by being involved in the liaison operation of the agency as well. One could assume that they had measured their risk. Yes, certainly. There is an element of risk in every operation, don't get me wrong. I do not know whether they had anything going or not. I would assume, just based on my experience, that they would not have tried to pitch Cubans, that they would have tried to exert subtle coercion on Mexicans working there to report in the interest of Mexican national security on what is going on in that embassy. Who would have been in a position to know if the Mexican government successfully penetrated the Cuban embassy or consulate? Then we have a whole sentence redacted here. The chief or chiefs of the Mexican service or services. Any Americans? Not that I know of. Do you know whether there was any coordination between the telephone tap operations and the photo operations? For example, if a conversation of interest came up on the tap operation, would the people monitoring the call be able to contact through an intermediary the photo basis to warn them or indicate to them that someone is coming of interest? It is my understanding that such a system did not exist, and I do not believe that the guys monitoring the telephone tap intercept bases were made aware of photograph coverage. However, I would assume that a man running a technical operation, if he had something exciting on the line, as opposed to a tape several days later, would notify his case officer right away, and then it might be possible for the case officer, assuming a quick reaction, to crank up the people at the photo house to take pictures. This was in the most perfect of all worlds. Usually things did not work out that way, and you end up out on the street in the middle of the night 2 days later contacting whoever it is taking photographs. Do you know whether the Mexico City station ever obtained a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald? To my understanding, they did not. I never saw anything down there that looked like Lee Harvey Oswald. Did you ever hear of an allegation that Charlotte Bustos at CIA headquarters in Washington found a photograph of Oswald, or someone she thought to be Oswald, in the headquarters file shortly after the assassination? No, I've never heard such a story. Knowing Charlotte, not knowing her well, but having known her over the years, I would assume that she had found such a thing. She would have rung a big, loud bell and said, "Hey, look what I found." With regard to photo operation, let us assume for a moment that you come across a picture of interest. Do you have any way of determining on what day and approximately what time the picture would have been taken? Very definitely. How would you have done that? The photographs were squared off and anointed. We knew the day. We knew usually morning or afternoon, AM or PM. Sometimes you could judge by the sequence. Furthermore, sometimes the actual time of the person going in and out was actually annotated. If the person operating was operating manually, he would no doubt. The guy with the red checkered Hawaiian shirt went in at 10:05. He would note that in the little log. I do not know whether he would note it on the photograph or submit the log with the number keyed to the log in the photograph. Quite often we knew the minute a person in a photograph came in or went out or stood in front or walked by. I see. So to your knowledge, there were photo production logs that could be checked. To my knowledge, such logs did exist, yes. Whether the logs were kept after the information was noted on the photograph, on the back of the photograph, or wherever it was noted, I have no idea. The photographs quite often came in the form of 35 millimeter contact strip prints and then blow-ups of a number of those. I recall I had not thought about it all these years, but usually you certainly knew when he went in on Tuesday morning, the 16th of May, whatever that date was. Who would make the notations on the back of the photograph or contact print as to the time? In our case, I believe it was the man taking the photographs, because he took the photographs, developed the photographs, printed them, and then turned them over. If he were to put the time on, would he have to go to his log and see what time the entry was made? Right. He probably made a little notation to himself, like I mentioned, the bright shirt or something. Then he would recognize that person in the photograph and make that notation. When was the first time that the name Lee Harvey Oswald came to your attention? It would have been the evening of the day of the assassination. How did that happen? We listened. We had a radio. I think it was out of those Zenith transoceanics in one of the embassy offices. I was out at an agent meeting when I heard about the assassination. I came back to the embassy and went upstairs and sat and stood around that radio. And I believe it was in Pat Johnson's office. Her name was something else in those days. I can't remember her married name. As they said something about the police, it was Lee Harvey Oswald or something. I do not remember. That was the first time that it came to my attention. I would like you now to take a look at CIA number 13, which is a transcript of the conversation allegedly involving Oswald, a conversation taking place on 1 October 63. Would you please read through that? When was the first time that you saw the transcript, if you've ever seen it before? I do not know whether I've ever seen it before, or not, but I may well have. I was aware that he had called the Soviet embassy, was aware after the notoriety of the man was established, but I do not recall ever seeing this before that. Normally, I would not. Prior to the assassination, did you see it? No, if I did, I did not pay attention. I do not believe it was on the Cuban line. No, it was not. Sometimes you can tell who saw these things by the initials up top. There are no writings or notations on that one, however. Would you please read CIA 177, which is a cable from Mexico City Station dated October 8th? Yes. This is typical where they try to identify somebody that was in the embassy at the time. Of course, that does not sound like it. This was the famous cable that has given rise to some of the issues that the committee was concerned with. My first question is, did you have anything to do with the writing of this cable? No, sir, I did not. I would not have had. Do you know how the photograph referred to in paragraph number 2 of that cable was in some way linked to Oswald? I would assume my answer to your question is no. I would assume that this is an effort on the part of the person drafting the cable to help headquarters identify Lee Oswald, the man who had made this call. Do you know how she made that conclusion that the photograph reflected Oswald? No, I did not think she did. I think she merely says that we got a guy who looks like he might be an American going in, and maybe this is the fellow. I do not see from this cable any conclusion that is Oswald. I rather suspect they never got a picture of Oswald. This is the one that appeared there that they looked at could be an American. Therefore, an effort was made to help headquarters by saying a man who looked like he'd be an American entered the Soviet embassy at that time. See, this is so fucked up because it doesn't take a goddamn rocket scientist or a fucking biologist or a doctor to look at somebody and be like, bro, you're from fucking Ukraine, or you're from Eastern fucking Europe, or you're from fucking Soviet Union. They have the most distinct bone structure you've ever fucking seen. You can pick a Russian out of a crowd from a fucking mile away. I'm telling you with certainty, the guy who showed up at the embassy that fucking day was a Russian. Obviously a Russian. Goldsmith says, I agree with you, Mr. Shaw. Certainly, the cable does not say the photograph is the photograph of Oswald. At the time, though, it gives information in paragraph 1 on Oswald, and the second paragraph makes reference to a photograph taken of someone who appears to be North American. Certainly, they would not have sent headquarters simply a cable indicating the existence of a photograph. So by putting the photograph in paragraph 2 immediately below the information on Oswald, although the cable does not say that the photograph is one of Oswald, it does in some way suggest that they are related. Shaw then says, it suggests to me that they know an American who claimed to be Lee Oswald, called at a certain time, and then they went to the photographs to see if they could find anybody who looked like he might be an American, and the photo they found was of a man apparently 35, athletic build, 6 foot tall, receding hairline, and so forth. They submitted this on the off chance that this might have been the man who made the call. I understand your answer. I'm hopeful that you understand that I'm not suggesting that the cable definitely says a photograph of Oswald. No, I don't see that it does at all. Would you please take a look now at CIA 183? All right, I've read it. This is a cable. It is not from CIA headquarters back to the Mexico City station responding to the earlier cable from the station reporting Oswald's contact. That is what it looks like to me. The 5th paragraph of the cable requests that the station keep headquarters advised of any further contacts or positive identification of Oswald. Yes. Do you know whether the station ever sent any additional information to headquarters concerning Oswald? No, I do not. And I do not recall ever seeing this cable either. Today is possibly the first time that you've ever seen the cable. It could very well be, yes. You may have with one of my initials on it, but I doubt it. Looking at CIA 183, there is an arrow pointed to the word Henry. Lee Henry Oswald, adjacent to the arrow, says SIC, S-I-C. What do you think Mr. Scott was intending to indicate when he wrote SIC next to Henry in the Lee Henry Oswald? I would rather suspect that he wrote this on here subsequent to the assassination. When the word came out, it was Harvey Oswald rather than Henry Oswald. Unless there is something in there that says Harvey. Is there any? No, there is none. I would imagine that there is something he wrote on later so that they would get the file in the right name. That would be my guess. Would you now take a look at CIA number 14? You may also want to take a look at CIA number 15 at the same time. Would you identify the document that you just reviewed? What it looks like is a normal LI envoy transcription. I see my name up there, but I don't see anything that indicates that I ever saw it. It looks like Scott and Goodpasture made checks on it. There's my name, but there's no indication, no initial on my part. Probably I did not see it. What is the date of that transcript? 28 September 1963 is what is listed on here. Do you recall whether you ever saw that transcript before? I do not recall. I must have seen it afterwards because I know Sylvia Duran was a person who had dealt with Oswald. When was the first time that this transcript was linked to Oswald? I have no idea. Let us backstep for a moment. The transcript that appears at CIA number 13 contains a notation in brackets by the transcriber that this is the same person who called a day or so ago. To the Soviet embassy, yes. Oswald also said I was there last Saturday. The transcript you just looked at, September 28th, was for a Saturday. Do you recall whether anyone came to you and asked you whether you were aware of a contact by Oswald? All right, so let's make one thing really fucking clear. You guys should already know this because I'm assuming all of you have read my book by now, right? Right. So September 28th, what else happened on September 28th when Oswald's allegedly in Mexico City? Oswald allegedly goes to the Sportsdrome rifle range where he has Malcolm Price set the scope on his rifle, right? So it can't be two places at once. It was Kerry Thornley in Mexico City. It was William Seymour at the Sportsdrome rifle range. I do not recall that anybody ever came to me, and I do not think they ever did. This sounds familiar. I would have heard about this after the assassination because I remember Sylvia Duran was the person being a Mexican citizen inside the Cuban embassy who I dealt with. In other words, the point was I was making on the October 1st transcript. It refers back to something that happened a day or two earlier, possibly Saturday, and I wondered if Herb Minell, when they were discussing this, came to discuss this matter with you. All right, let me pause right here because I'm starting to come up with a list of names in my head that we need to pull information on. We need to pull Herb Minell, all the testimony of Herb Minell. We need to pull everything surrounding Sylvia Duran and Roberto Duran. We need to pull the testimony of both Tarasovs, T-A-R-A-S-O-F. Two of them, they're the man and the wife, right? So, and that's what we need for now. Shit. You know something? We're going to get to the bottom of Mexico City. We're going to be on Mexico City for another fucking month. Shaw says, I don't believe they did. Barbara probably would have processed this, but I do not recall that anybody ever came to me. Fine. Would you please now take a look at CIA's numbers 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20? Here you have the one that I saw. Those are my initials on number 19. I did not see this one. Let me see what you got here. I have read it. Mr. Shaw, you've read through CIA document number 22. Yes, I have not read them carefully, but I looked over them. You looked at CIA number 16. Can you identify that document? This is an LI envoy transcript. It is a summary of a verbatim conversation. It is a summary. What is the date of that transcript? According to the thing on the margin, 27 September 63. 1963. This is really the same darn thing here. The same transcript that appears as CA number 17. It appears to be. Approximately what time was this phone call received? It looks to be put on pen 5 minutes after 4 in the afternoon. MF means a woman. Is that MF? Don't worry about that. When was the first time you saw this transcript? I do not remember. Did you see it before the assassination? I have no idea. Your name appears in the right-hand corner. My name appears there, however, it is not crossed out. If you turn over a couple pages, you'll see my initials on another thing which deals with the same time period. I will do that in a minute. Do you know whether the transcript was linked to Oswald prior to the assassination? I do not know whether it was or not. I gather it was not. Why is that? It does not say. There is no mark on it. Oswald on here anywhere. What are these numbers on the bottom right hand? This is a file number. What file would that be? That subject says 58106. I do not know offhand what that is. I think the 50 stands for Mexico. 8106 would be a subject file. Probably, possibly someplace where they put information on people where they are trying to travel to the Soviet Union. I do not know. That's a guess. Once again, a guy doesn't know nothing about what's going on down there. These fucking people are so incompetent. Let's take a look at CIA number 19. Okay, number 19, 27 September. That looks like my initial. It's very similar. In the upper right-hand corner, I cannot imagine anyone else putting it there. This is the conversation that took place later in that day. Is that correct? 27th September 1963, right? Is it fair to say this conversation took place around 4:26 in the afternoon, according to the documents? There is an indication there. When did this document first come to your attention? I have no idea because there was no date up there. I did not know when it was circulated or anything. Do you know when it was first linked to Oswald? I do not. Did Herbert or Barb Minnell ever come to you to discuss this transcript or conversation with you in reference to the transcript dated October 1st? Not that I remember. At the bottom of CIA number 19, it says copy Oswald P file. Essentially, did you know when that notation was put on? I do not. Turning back to CIA 177, there is a notation on the left-hand side of that page. It says D200-5-41. Do you know what that would refer to? I have no idea what the D stands for. The 200-5-41 sounds like a file number. Do you know for what? No, I do not, but I would assume, again, that maybe that would be, if it is in the 50 series, it would be a Mexico City file, but it may be a headquarters. This is a Mexico City document or a headquarters document. This is a headquarters document. That is a headquarters file number. I have no idea what the D stands for. It does not look right there. I've asked this question before, but for the record, for the purpose of clarification, I would like to ask you again to your knowledge. After the Mexico City station received the cable from headquarters dated October 10th or 11th, did the Mexico City station ever send any additional information concerning Oswald to headquarters? To my knowledge, they did not, but I would have no way of knowing. All right, so there's throwing something out here that I have no fucking idea what they're talking about. According to that, what he just said, headquarters sent some kind of memo to the Mexico City station on October 10th about Oswald. I'd like to find that memo. To my knowledge, I did not, but I would have no way of knowing. Did you ever speak to Herb Minnell about this? No. Barbara Minnell? No. Dave Phillips? No. What, if anything, do you know about the arrest of Sylvia Duran shortly after the assassination? I remember that Sylvia Duran was arrested. I do not know why. I could have suggested that myself, but I do not remember. I do remember sending a message to Win Scott suggesting that right after the assassination that the Mexicans put in a ring of guards around the Cuban embassy and question everybody going in and out. I remember that idea coming out of my head. I know that Sylvia Duran was arrested. She was fair game because she was a Mexican national and the Cubans, she did not have any Cuban diplomatic immunity. I would have thought it would have to be a good idea to question her very closely. As to whether I said that she would be arrested or I had anything to do with that, I do not know. I was perfectly capable of making such a suggestion. Do you know why headquarters was upset about that arrest? I have no idea. Do you know why headquarters did not want any Americans to confront her or to interview her? No. Do you have any reason to believe that Oswald may have been an agent of the KGB? I have no reason to believe it. How about an agent, asset, or source of the CIA? I would think that would be completely out of the question. For purposes of the record, could you explain why you think it would be out of the question? Because I think it would have come to light immediately had he had any CIA connections. In what manner? Somebody would have revealed this fact. Had he been an agent of the CIA, asset, or employee, is it possible that someone would have been able to cover up that fact? I do not think that anyone would have covered that up. Why not? Had he been an agent, then it would have been on the record somewhere. Is it possible that the record could have been erased or purged in some way? I seriously doubt it. Could you give a reason? It's just my belief that the integrity of the organization, it stands on that and the people in it. That's hilarious. Does the agency, to your knowledge, have any safeguards to prevent records or from being erased or purged? Nowadays, of course, we have laws which say you can't destroy material. I would say that safeguards, again, come back to the basic integrity of the people at the organization. When you lose a president, you do not mess around, and I think everybody would have turned over every possible stone to find out anything they could that would be useful in determining the responsibility for the assassination. All right, as he says this, keep in mind that Ted Shackley, George Ioannidis, and fucking David Morales were in Dealey fucking Plaza. Okay? Fuck these people. All right, so let me read that again. They would have turned over every stone to find out whose responsibility for the assassination. He goes, I know I would have. I was a Kennedy man, and I imagine there were a lot of us in the outfit who identified very closely with President. Did you ever know anybody by the name of Maurice Bishop? No. Do you know whether David Phillips or anyone else ever used the name Maurice Bishop as an operational alias of some kind? I'm not aware that they did, but I would have to answer your question no. Dave Phillips does not seem like a Maurice type somehow. Did headquarters ever criticize the Mexico City station in any way for its handling of the Oswald matter prior to the assassination? Not that I'm aware of. For that matter, after the assassination? Not that I'm aware of. I must add to the criticism would have been conveyed to the chief of station rather than to the case officers. When Oswald returned to the United States from the Soviet Union, would it have been standard operating procedure for the agency to have interviewed him or debriefed him in some way? No, I think it would have been more likely for the FBI to interview him. Why is that? Because he's an American citizen in the United States. That was FBI's territory. Even though Oswald worked for several years, not for several years, but for some time in a radio factory while he was in Russia. I was not aware that he worked in a radio factory, but the fact that he had been in the Soviet Union, the fact that he had been in the United States Marine Corps would indicate to me that if he'd been interviewed, he would have had been interviewed by the FBI. Does not the agency have a domestic contacts division or service, which was customarily interviews people who have been abroad in communist countries? The agency has the domestic contacts division. It used to be called OO Contacts. I never work with those people. It's my understanding that what they do is routinely debrief if the person is willing businessman in the old days, tourists who had visited the Soviet Union, or to brief a man who might have other involvement in the Soviets, would not, I believe, have fallen within the purview of the OO Contacts branch. Do you have any knowledge of the operations activity of the CI-SIG branch of the CIA? No, I do not know what SIG means. I've never heard of CI or SIG. CI is counterintelligence staff, and I don't know what SIG is. Mr. Shaw, I think I would like to thank you for your testimony today. I especially would like to thank you for spending all this time with us. So I want you to realize this motherfucker who's been working in the agency for 30 fucking years, still employed there, says he doesn't know what CI is. He goes, no, I don't know what SIG means. I've never heard of CI-SIG. Give me a break. Customarily, whenever a witness testifies before the committee, a witness is given an opportunity to make a statement for the record. It's not a hearing, but I would like to give you the same opportunity if you'd like to make a statement. Well, I might take advantage of it. I'd not thought about it until you mentioned it, but hearkening back to what I said a little while ago, I do believe that our organization was made up of, like Bill Colby has on the cover of his book over there on the next table, of honorable men. And I don't think that anyone in the secret organization would have allowed any cover-up of any destruction of evidence which might have shed some light on the assassination of President Kennedy. Is he really that naive? Really? Really? Or do we not know that the level of the depths to which the CIA would stoop back in those days? I might add a little vignette. We had what it was called Libra Pessima, which is a book that the people signed when they come to a funeral or something. You may have run into something like this in the States. When you go in and sign it at the funeral parlor, then you were there or something, you express your regrets. Pessima in Spanish means regrets or sorrow. We had a book down in the lobby of the embassy building, and when I came out one day shortly after the assassination, somebody in the crowd yelled Spanish for Bob, and I went over, and it was the governor of the state of Sonora, which is a big state up in northwestern Mexico. I had known him some years earlier. He was the son of the general who was outstanding military leader of the Mexican Revolution from about 1913 to about 1920. His father had been president of Mexico. His father was assassinated, having been elected to a second term. He was already elected and had not taken office. I was profoundly touched by the presence of his son, of the assassinated president, in the lobby of our embassy, to in turn express his sorrow for the assassination of our president. This does not prove anything in one way or another, but it makes a tremendous effect on me. As I mentioned very earlier in our session, I'm not aware that there was any exultation, satisfaction, or happiness inside the Cuban embassy over the assassination of the president. And I think in my personal belief that everything points to Lee Harvey Oswald as having done it, and done it alone. There is nothing I have ever seen or heard which would lead me to accept for one moment any complicity on the part of my agency or any other agency of the United States government. Thank you, Mr. Shaw. I would like to add that as soon as the transcript is ready, blah, 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 and that's it for this one. So, but I want to point something out here, because his somber closing paragraphs, they show something quite differently though, right? He puts such faith and stock in the integrity of the men who run this agency that it's absolutely fucking unbelievable. Well, that's going to do it for today, guys. I'll be back tomorrow.